In this last video on English mercantilistic policy in the 17th century and the development of regional economies, north, south, and west, and so forth, I want to point out that the colonies weren't really united internally. There were internal tensions in many colonies that at times threatened violence. Now I'm going to try to keep the focus on the 17th century, the 1600s, but I'm going to mention a couple of revolts in the 18th century, the 1700s, because the same dynamics were at play. Since the wealthy landowners often dominated the colonial government, and they lived in the more developed East, they worried less about issues like Indian protection or building infrastructure. When the people were poor, as I've said, they naturally went to the western frontier for land. Many recently released from the indentured servant contracts and, had nothing, quite poor. When these poor people out west on the frontier demanded help and protection, the colonial governments in the East often refused to assist them because, the wealthy people were the ones represented in those governments and they refused to raise their own taxes. And this tension grew in the 1600s and exploded into violence. And I'm going to also mention a couple of violent revolts in the 18th century as well. This happened as early as 1676 in Virginia. There, Nathaniel Bacon led a rebellion against the royally appointed governor, known as Bacon's Rebellion. That's what they called it. Facing an angry mob, that Governor William Berkeley, first backed down and promised the poor Westerners more representation in the colonial government. He was going to tax the wealthy people and provide what the people out west wanted. And these were so-called Bacon laws he promised to pass. Later, however, Berkeley, convinced he had undermined Bacon's support, reneged on this promise. And Bacon's pretty ticked off, and so he again led an angry mob. And this time he forced Berkeley to flee, and Bacon then burned Jamestown, which was the capital of Virginia. In time, the angry mob frenzy did indeed abate, and Berkeley returned to power, and he ended up hanging 37 of the rebels. Bacon wasn't hanged, but he died of dysentery, which is not the way you want to go. So looking at the East-West tensions, this is in the 18th century, so let me just throw in here a couple of 18th century East-West tension revolts. The same dynamic played out 100 years later, first in 1763 in Pennsylvania. There, the so-called Paxton Boys, which were from the western town of Paxton, marched on the Colonial Assembly in Philadelphia, which was dominated by the pacifist Quakers. Violence was averted when Benjamin Franklin, of course we'll mention him later on, used his reputation to convince the Paxton Boys that the government would listen to their demands. In the end, of course, the people back east didn't do much reform. So I wouldn't say the Paxton Boys were successful. Another 18th century revolt was only 4 years later in North and South Carolina. It was more organized and a larger rebellion, and it lasted until 1771. So this is very, very late in the colonial period. This rebellion became known as the Regulator Movement because they formed associations to demand protective regulations for the western frontier. In South Carolina, the courts agreed to hear their demands, and the regulators disbanded, so it was successful. In North Carolina, however, violence broke out at the so-called Battle of Almonance, and there a large colonial army protecting the eastern legislators defeated the Western Regulator Movement. And therefore, the Westerners then won little relief from these rebellions. But again, the Paxton Boys and the Regulators are after the 17th century, but it's the same dynamic that really was as early as the Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. Back to the 17th century, the 1600s. In the late 1600s, a political development in England had ripples across the Atlantic. In 1685, the king at the time was James II, who decided he was going to revoke the colonial governments and create one administrative government for all the New England colonies, and he called it the Dominion of New England. So he wanted to get rid of all the colonial governments and create a dominion, and he appoints one royal governor, a guy named Edmund Andros, and you can see Edmund Andros on the left and James II on the right here. Edmund Andros was going to govern this new Dominion of New England. The colonists in the colonies didn't like this because they felt it, gave them less influence. Now, at this time, the power of Parliament had been growing relative to the power of the king in England. And in 1688, Parliament forced James II to abdicate, to leave the throne. And Parliament got a new king, William and Mary. And this became known as the Glorious Revolution because there was no violence. You can really see the power of Parliament surpassing the power of the kings by this point. But anyway, after 1688, with no James II, Andros's power base back in the Dominion of New England was gone, and the colonists knew that, and they locked up Andros in the Dominion of New England, and eventually allowed him to return to England. But in New York, one of the lieutenant governors, one of the Andros lieutenant governors, was a guy named Francis Nicholson. You can see him on the right here. He refused to go. So as Francis Nicholson, this sort of lieutenant governor of the Dominion of New England, refused to go like his boss Andros, a colonist led a rebellion against him, and it was led by a guy named Jacob Leisler, and became known as Leisler's Rebellion. Now, it was successful, and for 3 years, from 1689 to 1691, Leisler ruled New York. By then, large merchants in England realized that Leisler was sort of bad for their business in America, and they convinced William and Mary to send a force to regain control. So ultimately, Leisler's rebellion failed in the end. But this concludes the short little video on the reality that when you talk about the 17th century and even into the 18th century, there were a lot of internal tensions, economic and otherwise, in the colonies themselves. This concludes this video and the last video and the idea of English mercantilism in the 17th century and the development of regional economies.